Kia ora everybody and welcome back to Teaology, where we drink tea and talk theology. Today we are drinking ginger and apple tea from Twinings, and this tea is kind of relevant because the most common fruit associated with today's topic is an apple, and that would be the fall. Now this is a big topic and we're not going to cover all of it, but I've got a lot of thoughts, so this might be kind of a long video. We'll see. The fall is the story that follows just after the creation narrative in Genesis, and it's kind of the story explaining how evil came into the world. The creation narrative has left us with a lovely picture of man and woman working together to look after and steward the earth that God has made. It's there to look after the garden and care for the animals in it. They have an abundance of food that grows on the trees and bushes and in the ground, and they can eat from all except one tree in the middle of the garden. Everything there was created through God's words, except people who he formed from the dust and breathed into. Humans were created in the image of God. And then comes Genesis 3. Now, I'm not going to read the entire scripture as it's the whole chapter and it's quite long, but I will be referring mostly to the ESV version. The story is in 3 parts: the temptation, the fall, and the curse. The story begins with Eve and the serpent tempting Eve, trying to convince her to take of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is the tree they are not meant to eat from. The serpent begins by placing doubt. Did God actually say you can't eat fruit from any tree in the garden? He asks a question with misleading information. Eve corrects him, saying basically, no, we can eat from any other tree in the garden, but you can't eat from this one. Otherwise we'll die. The serpent, only after engaging her and thinking about it, outright lies, saying, you will surely not die. For God knows that when you eat, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. He is saying that death, which has been said will occur, won't occur. Instead, we shall be made wise, knowing good and evil. She then chose to eat the fruit, as did Adam. What I find particularly interesting here is that both Adam and Eve, it implies a present for this conversation with the serpent, and Adam could have told Eve at any point to stop. He could have answered the question. He could have told Eve to not answer the question, but instead he chose to listen. He listened to what Eve had to say and chose his actions based on that. We don't know what he was thinking, but he obviously agreed with Eve enough to decide to eat the fruit himself. Often people place the blame only on women, when in fact both parties were equally capable of stopping, of disengaging, of not buying into what the serpent says. After eating the fruit, this is when Adam and Eve fell. This is when the kind of fall part of the story happens. They felt shame for their nakedness for the first time, so they made clothes. They were afraid for the first time, so they hid from God. They passed the blame around to each other. This is the first time that we start to see these things of blame and fear and shame come into the story. God knows the whole time exactly what has occurred, but allowed them to make their own choices about the temptation. They had everything they could ever need, access to all that was good for them, yet they made the choice to focus on the one thing that they didn't have, even though it would not be good for them. So this is when they first experienced the fall. They fell from where they once were and have opened themselves up to brokenness. Nobody wants to take the blame for what happened either. Adam blamed Eve even though he was there and he chose for himself. Eve blamed the serpent for lying even though she knew what the truth was. God has been forced to take action. They knowingly went against the rules he had set out to protect them, to look after them. He gave them the ability to choose, but that doesn't mean that choices come without consequences. Some come in the form of specific curses, while others come as a consequence of sin or what sin results in. And these curses and these things that he says will occur are the next part of the story. He begins with the serpent, saying that the serpent is cursed. However, in this cursing, in the speaking of active hostility, he starts to speak out his plan to redeem. So he curses the snake to crawl on the ground for the rest of its days, and for there to always be hostility between the people and the snake. And the end of verse 15, he says, "He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel." And this is often talked about even throughout the Bible, and the Old Testament included, as the promise of the Messiah, the snake crusher. So we end with the snake itself being cursed, and the relationship between all future generations and the snake being actively hostile towards each other. He then says to the woman, in summary, there will be pain in childbirth and contradictory desires between husband and wife. I would personally say this is one of the most misunderstood verses, or at least most practically applied misunderstandings of this whole section. And because of these misunderstandings, because of the way it's often really used against women and the church, and people generally, there are a few really crucial things that I want to pull out and extrapolate when we look at the verses, when we look at it, when we try to do an exegesis instead of reading our own culture into it. Now that's really hard to do. You can't fully get rid of your own culture when you're reading, but really trying to take it for what it is. So first off, I notice that he says he curses the snake, and he specifically says cursed, but he doesn't say that about the woman. He just says to the woman this. If it was a curse, then God would have said it was a curse, as he does in the rest of the passage. God is saying is that this is what will follow, which is kind of different. It's not a specific curse. It is what sin results in. And sin results in brokenness. So the birth of children and relationship with children is broken because of the pain and the risk. The relationship between man and woman has been broken because sin was invited in through the eating of the fruit. Things have been broken. It is not the curse in the same way that other things in this passage are cursed. Since God is speaking the consequences of action here, this means it is not the way he has designed it. If it is broken, then it is not the way it was meant to be. It is not meant to kill and bring huge amounts of pain for women to give birth and to bring life into this world, which God ordered. God said, go forth and multiply, but he has made it, but because of the consequences of actions, he's made it incredibly risky. Or has he made it? I don't really know. It has become incredibly risky to follow out that command because of the pain childbirth brings, because of the risk with childhood diseases. It has made it difficult. Raising children is also difficult. Disease and famine and other hardships. He obviously didn't intend for it to be that way, because this was only spoken in after brokenness came in. This is the same with the husband. These words are spoken directly to the woman. Adam can hear them, but they're spoken directly to the woman, not to both of them. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. So this whole passage that he says he said to the woman is spoken directly to the woman. The others are present for it though. So now, in his original design, women were equal to men, as both were made in the image of God. They weren't the same, but they were equal. Now, you can have two things, considered of equal standing, but are not the same thing. And they were equal in the sense that none were more or less the image of God. They both were fully they were both the image of God, but they both reflected different parts of God, because God is huge and we are only a part of an image of him. However, this curse means that women have been forced to be inferior. There is now a hierarchy there that there shouldn't be, because the husband shall rule over them and their desires will be contrary. It becomes a battle of exploitation where historically women have lost that battle of exploitation. The relationship itself is broken because both are seeking to serve themselves in it. And we see that God's desire, his design, was for both to be submitted to each other, not for one to exploit the other. His desire also wasn't necessarily for this hierarchy in the way that we see it. In this, it says, he shall rule over you, which implies that hierarchy is a result of the brokenness. These verses are often used to justify acting this way in Christian circles. But when access to safe birthing situations are denied for women, or when the husband is told he is supposed to rule over his wife, with the justification being in Genesis 3, this is not living out the way God has designed us. When we come into Christ, we are made new. When we come into Christ, we are meant to start living in the way that he's designed us, which means we shouldn't be living with the inferiority type of thing. We should be both submitting to Christ and then to God. It talks about this in Ephesians. Should be working to live as God designed, and part of that can be using the tools that he has given the world to ensure that we can have safe birthing situations. When we come to know Christ and live by him, these consequences don't come into play because we're being made new. We're undoing what was done in the fall. We live in the now and the not yet, where the curses are still active in the world, but he comes in and breaks through either directly or indirectly, sometimes to help us work around it. Now, experiencing pain in childbirth or marriage is not a sign of lesser faith. I am getting at the fact that while these will still occur, God has been working with people to help change them, whether that be through marriage counseling or actively choosing to both submit to God, or through modern medicine and the breakthroughs in maternal and children health. Those things are still true. It is not God's design for them to be true. This is really important. We can't use these things as justification for denying women access to safe birth. We can't use these things as justification for men to be above women. Now, with Adam, he doesn't curse Adam directly. Actually, God doesn't use the word curse at all when he's talking to people. He uses it when he's talking to the snake, and he uses it when talking to Adam. But when he's talking to Adam, he says curse about the ground, not about him. And this is the longer section when he's talking to Adam out of all of the sections where he's talking to people. First, God says why Adam is being cursed. He ate from the fruit just as much as Eve did. He made his own decision. And he's basically saying, your excuse means nothing. It doesn't matter what she said to you. You could have told her not to as well, you know. He's basically saying your excuse doesn't mean anything by saying, this is why I'm cursing you. The result of this is the ground being cursed. Now, God curses the ground. He doesn't curse Adam. But the curse on the ground results in many consequences for Adam. In the garden, stewarding the earth and looking after the animals was easier. There was no scarcity, for it was paradise. So God blessed the earth and he blessed the garden, which resulted in fruitfulness. So not a curse of barrenness. To get anything from it now means it's hard work, because the earth has been cursed with barrenness, basically. Ultimately, this results in work being cursed. Work was meant to be a good thing, but it has been cursed because of Adam's disobedience. The relationship that Adam has with work and with the ground, which is his work, is broken. John Mark Comer has written an excellent book exploring this idea of work being cursed, called Garden City, which I highly recommend reading. But basically, it means that our relationship with our work is broken. There are ways that we can live with God in it, that we can live in that now and not yet thing, in the same way with the woman and man and woman and child. Our relationship with work is also broken. And so much of how we live these days in some of our core relationships and some of our core developmental relationships, and in terms of our work, which is how we end up spending much of our time, those are all broken. And by work being cursed, by work being broken, it means our rest is also broken, because work and rest kind of go together. When to be good at work, you need to rest. For rest to be meaningful, there needs to be work. And then this results in them being exiled from the garden, so they can no longer live in paradise at all. And I think it's really important to read these verses and go, what we're going back to is Eden, is that garden city that John Mark Comer talks about in his book. That is ultimately where we are designed to be. But we aren't there yet. And we are living in a world where these core relationships that we have are broken. So how can we live in that now and not yet space and really work with God in that? You know, we start the year going in and it's going, how can we go back to life? How can we live life more in line with how God has designed us to be able to live? How can we bring God and submit ourselves to God, so that we can be in good relationship with each other? How can we listen to God so that our work isn't as destructive as it has been in the past? How can we give that to God, even when it's hard and difficult, and where you get punished for for working in the way that God has called you to? So how can we do that well? How can we set up healthy relationships? What does it mean to rest? What does it mean to rest well? What does it mean to work? What does it mean to work well? What does it mean to be married? How do you be married well? What does it mean to raise kids? How do you raise kids well? What does it mean to be in relationship with other people around you, and how do you do that well? And these are all questions that God is calling us to ask ourselves, because they are what calls us into living more like Jesus did, because a huge part of Jesus's ministry was outward. So it was going, your work is something that comes out of you, your rest is something that goes in, but that's important. Your relationships are something that God can flow out of you in. All of those are things that God can work out of you. So how do we let God work out of us in those places? How do we submit ourselves to God so that he can be good in those places? Well, he will always be good in every place he goes, but how can we partner with him in that? And ultimately, how can we be good stewards of the earth God has given us? Because his original calling has not changed. We are still called to be good stewards. I'll see you all next week as we drink more tea and talk about some more theological concepts. And yeah, bye. Hope you enjoyed.